When I was in middle school, I know that's a way to start a sermon. But when I was in middle school, the MSNBC logo got burned into the bottom corner of my dad and stepmom's television screen. I kid you not. Whether the television was off or tuned into Nickelodeon, that little MSNBC logo glistened in the corner. How did this happen, you might ask? It happened because my stepmom, hi Gail, had MSNBC on in the background all the time. And in case you think I'm judging her, I'm lucky that the Times of Israel hasn't burned a logo onto my phone, especially this week. What I didn't understand then, but do understand now, is that the news can pull us in. It pulls us in with dramatic music and enticing cliffhangers. It pulls us in with panic that the worst is coming. It pulls us in by reinforcing our fears that those people, whoever those people are dangerous and out to get us. And once the panic, the frenzy, the suspicion sets in, we can easily become part of the problem. In this week's Torah portion, Devarim, Moses recaps a story from the book of Numbers in which 10 Israelite spies become part of the problem. As the story goes, Moses sends 12 spies to scout out the land of Israel from a Negev hilltop and awaits their report. They begin their description with good news of a land flowing with milk and honey, you know it. But they quickly pivot into panic. Our enemies are over there, and they are much more powerful than us, they say. One brave spy, Caleb, tries to calm his fellow scouts down. It'll be okay. We're strong enough. No way, the other spies cry out. At this point, they are exasperated. There are giants over there. We look like tiny grasshoppers to ourselves. So all the more so must we look like tiny grasshoppers to them. The scouts assume they know what the people over there think of them. Well, here's what happens next. The panic spreads. The Israelites hear the report of the spies, and they weep all night long. They cry out, "If only we had died in the wilderness." And then, as if they've completely forgotten the horrors of slavery, some of them suggest they turn back towards Egypt. Can you imagine that? Go back to Egypt? It's shocking. But the Israelites are terrified of the people over there, and their anxiety spreads like wildfire. Caleb and another spy, Joshua, try to boost morale, but it's too late. The Israelites have made up their minds that the worst is yet to come. If I'm honest, I think I know what that's like. Maybe you do too. And if you don't, please teach the rest of us how to be more calm, cool, and collected. But last month, on the night of the attempted assassination of former President Trump, the dread for me began to set in. I thought to myself, the pre-election political violence is starting, and there is nothing we can do. The news, of course, only fed this sense of impending doom with words and phrases like crisis, civil war, alarming scenarios, huge spike in violence, and with questions like, how bad will political violence in the U.S. get? As if political violence is inevitable. At the risk of asking an overly optimistic question, what if political violence is not inevitable? And what if we play a role in preventing it? As many of you know, I have been involved in the work of crossing divides and reducing toxic polarization since I witnessed and counter-protested the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. Through my work with an organization called the One America Movement, I've had the opportunity to learn from researchers and educators at an organization called More in Common. More in Common conducts cutting-edge research on polarization in our country and around the world. They study something called perception gaps. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of perception gaps. Okay, those of you who have taken my class know what it is. Perception gaps are how members of one group misperceive the members of the outgroup. So for example, Republicans think that Democrats are much more extreme than they actually are, and Democrats think that Republicans are much more extreme than they actually are. And many of us assume that the other side dislikes us much more than they actually do. We assume they see us as grasshoppers when they actually don't. So I'm going to do something that I don't often do from the Bema. Right now, I'm going to talk numbers. I want to tell you about some research that More in Common conducted just after the assassination attempt a few weeks ago. And I'm going to ask you to have an open mind as I share a few of their findings. And I really mean this. I welcome your questions, your comments, your ideas, your suspicion maybe after the service. All right, so are you ready? Okay. So after the attempted assassination of former President Trump, More in Common theorized, they had a guess, that Democrats might be fearful of retaliatory violence, and in turn, predict high levels of support for violence within the Republican Party. Okay, so More in Common conducted this research to test their theory, and they found that they were correct. Democrats estimate almost 4 times as many Republicans are willing to condone violence as they really are. Okay, so I'm going to say it another way. Democrats grossly overestimate support for violence in the Republican Party. And people from all political parties feel vulnerable right now. Democrats, independents, and Republicans alike are very concerned about violence. 71% of Americans expect more civil violence to occur in the lead up to the November election. And here's the problem. The more that one side overestimates the extremism of the other side, the more they believe that violence is unavoidable. And why does this matter? Because when people on one side think the other side is willing to engage in political violence, they in turn become more tolerant of violence themselves, making it more likely to occur. Do you see the loop here? So a belief that everyone else is ready to take up arms, the panic that comes from it, the fear of the other can all combine to create norms of violence. The more that the news and social media amplify the panic and use buzzwords that draw us into fear, the more that we mimic this language and buy into a belief of impending doom, the more dangerous our pre-election world becomes. But in reality, research indicates that the vast majority of Americans across political parties reject political violence. And in fact, the Polarization Research Lab released a study on July 23rd that found that support for political violence has decreased, has gone down across both parties since the assassination attempt. So, with all of this in mind, now is the time to remain calm and resist emotional manipulation. Now is the time to remember that panic spreads and has serious consequences. The panic-driven spies and the Israelites who follow them pay a hefty price for the contagious pessimism and disquiet that they spur. God decides that aside from Caleb and Joshua, the rest will never set foot in the promised land. A tragic end to a disconcerting story. Our story can have a different ending. We don't have to doom scroll our way into a doom-filled election season. We can follow in the footsteps of Caleb and Joshua, who maintain their composure, who dare to believe that everything could turn out okay, maybe even better than okay. And if we decide to do that, if we decide not to consume the fear and feed the frenzy, not to contribute to norms of violence by talking about it as if the wheel is already set in motion, we can do a lot of other things instead. Instead, we can work to rejuvenate connections across lines of difference. Instead, we can work to strengthen norms around democracy and have healthy discussions about issues that matter to us. Instead, we can ask ourselves if we are making assumptions about groups of people without actually knowing them, or assuming that they think the worst about us. Instead, we can commit to learning one another's human stories from a place of curiosity and sharing our own. And if we can do this, and I believe that we can, we might just see our country become a safe haven for democracy and a promised land. Shabbat shalom.